The coffee in the conference room was always slightly burned. 7 years of mornings at Aldercroft, and I could tell by the smell alone when they'd brewed it too early and left it sitting. That morning, the burned smell was there before I even opened the door. Dorian was already seated. That was unusual. He was a man who arrived to meetings precisely on time. Never before, as if punctuality were a form of control, which for him it was. The fact that he was already there, already settled, already with his hands folded on the table, told me everything I needed to know about why he'd scheduled this particular meeting for a Tuesday at 9. I sat down. I did not pour the coffee. "Vesper," he said. "Dorian." He had the termination letter face down on the table. I knew it was a termination letter because I had written them for him before. And I knew the weight of that paper. Aldercroft used a heavier stock for formal correspondence, 80-pound, cream-colored. And I knew the particular way it sat when it was folded at the center, thick with its own formality. He turned it over. I read the first 3 lines and stopped. The company was restructuring. My position, Director of Client Operations, was being eliminated. My last day would be in 2 weeks. My severance was outlined in the attached document. "I wanted to tell you personally," Dorian said. I put the letter down. "Who's taking the role?" It wasn't a question. He heard that. There was a pause that lasted approximately 1 second. In that second, I watched something move behind his eyes. Not guilt, exactly. Oh, more like the particular discomfort of a man who has done something he cannot undo and has since convinced himself it was necessary. "We're reframing the position," he said. "Dorian, who is taking the role?" He said Seraphine's name. I had heard it twice before. Once at the company winter event 6 months ago, when she had appeared at Dorian's side in a way that was introduced as professional but felt personal. Once in an email thread 3 weeks ago, copied in with no explanation on a client correspondence I had originated and managed for 2 years. I looked at the letter again. I looked at the date. He had scheduled this meeting the same week that Aldercroft's largest quarterly review was due. The one I had been preparing since January. The one that required 3 separate client presentations, a full system audit, and the annual reconciliation of the Hargrove account. Our most complex, most valuable, and most temperamental client. 2 weeks, I said. "We'll support a smooth transition." I folded the letter along its existing crease. I put it in my bag. I stood up. "Thank you," I said. He blinked. I think he had expected something else. An argument. A question about why. An attempt to negotiate. I walked out of the conference room and back to my desk, and I poured myself a coffee from the small machine in the corner that I had personally requested 3 years ago because the conference room pot was always burned. I drank it at my desk. I started my transition document. There are things I should explain about what I had built at Aldercroft over 7 years, because without understanding that, none of what followed makes sense. And I had come in as an account coordinator. Junior, one of 4. Within 18 months, I was senior. Within 3 years, I had restructured the entire client operations function, not because anyone asked me to, but because the way it worked was inefficient, and the inefficiency was costing the company money it hadn't noticed it was losing. I built the client management system we used. Not metaphorically. I had written the specification document, worked with the external developer to implement it, trained every person who touched it, and maintained the documentation. The system was called internally by a name the team had given it. They called it the Vesper system, which was a joke that stopped being a joke after about a year. I managed the Hargrove account personally. Hargrove and Associates were our largest client, I may bringing in 40% of annual revenue, and they were difficult in the specific way that only very old money can be. Exacting, traditional, deeply averse to any change in personnel. They dealt with me. They had dealt with me for 5 years. Their senior partner, a man named Osric Hargrove, who had once told me I was the only person at Aldercroft who understood what his firm actually needed, had my direct number. Not the company number, my direct number. I had also, over the course of the past 8 months, during which I had noticed the specific quality of attention Seraphine was receiving and the specific quality of attention I was not, done something that most people would not think to do until it was too late. I had documented everything, not just work notes. Also, not just the kind of documentation that lives on a company server and belongs to the company when you leave. I had kept a parallel record. Every client communication I had originated, time-stamped, and saved to a personal archive. Every process I had designed, every system I had built, the original specification documents, which I had authored in my own name at home before submitting them internally. 8 months of quiet, specific preparation. When you work in client operations long enough, you understand that the relationships are the product. The systems are just infrastructure. And the relationships, the 5 years of monthly calls with Osric Hargrove, the institutional memory of what his firm needed and how it needed to be delivered, those do not transfer with a job title. They transfer with a person. Or they don't transfer at all. And the 2 weeks passed the way the end of things always does. Slower than you expect, and then suddenly over. I spent them doing exactly what I said I would do in the transition document, outlining processes, creating handover notes, attending the meetings I was asked to attend. I was professional. I was thorough. I trained no one because there was no one to train. Seraphine had not yet been formally introduced to the team, and the one time she appeared during my final 2 weeks, she was shown around the floor by Dorian's assistant, not by me. She had dark hair and wore a particular kind of confident expression I recognized immediately. The expression of someone who has been told they deserve something, not someone who has earned it. She was perhaps 29. She had, and I learned from Gideon, who told me things I had not asked for but was grateful to receive, done 2 years at a competing firm in a junior capacity, and had since moved through positions in ways that did not follow the ordinary logic of advancement. Gideon worked in financial analysis at Aldercroft and had the kind of dry, specific loyalty that comes from years of sharing a floor and a certain orientation toward competence. He was not the type to editorialize. When he described Seraphine's background, he simply said, "It doesn't add up to this role." On my last day, I cleared my desk. I left the coffee machine. I had considered taking it. I decided it was more useful as a monument. I said goodbye to the people who mattered. I did not say goodbye to Dorian. He was in a meeting, or said to be in one. His assistant delivered this information with the careful neutrality of someone who knows she is being made to lie and has chosen the path of least self-involvement. I took the elevator down. The lobby smelled like the cleaning product they used every morning, something citrus and chemical that I had breathed for 7 years. And for a moment, it hit me in a way I hadn't expected. Not grief, exactly. More like the particular sharpness of something ending. I walked out. I had 3 things in my bag: my personal laptop, a hard drive containing my archived documentation, and the business card of an attorney named Balthazar Crispin, who specialized in intellectual property and employment law, which I had been carrying for 6 weeks. I had an appointment with him the following morning. Although the coffee at Balthazar Crispin's office was excellent. This surprised me. He was a small man in a large chair, methodical in the way that good lawyers are methodical. Not slow, just careful. He read through everything I placed in front of him, then he looked up and said, "Walk me through how the system specification was authored." I walked him through it. The original specification document for the Aldercroft client management system had been written by me on my personal computer during evenings and weekends over a 6-week period before I formally presented it internally. I had the metadata. I had the drafts. I had the email where I had sent it to myself, time-stamped, before I had ever attached it to an internal communication. The system, the Vesper system, as it was still called, was proprietary software that Aldercroft had paid an external developer to build according to my specifications. The question of who owned the intellectual property of the underlying design concept was, as Balthazar put it, interesting. Interesting how? I asked. Interesting in the sense that employment contracts typically assign IP created in the course of employment to the employer, he said. But the question of when the work was created, before you were formally assigned this task on your own time and equipment, creates a legitimate question about that assignment. He paused. You're not necessarily going to win this on IP, but you don't need to win it. You need it to be complicated enough that they want to resolve it without litigation. I understood that distinction. Maybe it was the same distinction I used with difficult clients. You don't need to be right. You need the cost of being wrong to be higher than the cost of agreeing with you. There's something else, I said. I put the Hargrove correspondence file on his desk. I want to understand what protections exist around client relationships. He looked at the file. He was quiet for a moment. Are there non-solicitation clauses in your employment contract? Yes. They apply to direct solicitation. They don't apply to clients contacting me. He nodded slowly. No, he said. They don't. I had been out of Aldercroft for 4 days when Gideon called me. I was in my apartment, which was quiet in a way the office never had been. I had been using the silence. I was building something. I'll explain that shortly. And the silence was useful. Day one, he said. I put down my pen. Tell me. Gideon described events the way a camera would. Seraphine had arrived at 8:15. She had been given my desk, my login credentials, and a printed version of my transition document. She had a meeting with the Hargrove account team at 9. How did it go? I asked. She referred to Osric Hargrove as Oscar in the first minute. I was quiet. Twice, Gideon said. Osric Hargrove was 73 years old, the third-generation head of a firm that had been operating since before most of the people at Aldercroft were born. He had once, very quietly, withdrawn business from a competitor because their lead contact had sent him an email with 2 spelling errors. Not the content of the email. The spelling errors, the name mispronunciation was not a minor thing. Sonnet, it was the kind of thing that would be noted and remembered, and in the Hargrove way, never mentioned again, but never forgotten either. What did he do? I asked. He corrected her once, then he went quiet. You know how he goes quiet. I did know. That particular silence meant that Osric Hargrove had made a decision and would not be reversing it. What else? I said. She couldn't find the quarterly reconciliation file. She asked me where it was. I showed her. She looked at it for a while, and then she said she'd need someone to walk her through it. The quarterly reconciliation file for Hargrove was a living document I had maintained for 5 years. It had its own logic, its own architecture, its own internal notation system that I had developed because the Hargrove account required a level of granular tracking that the standard system didn't support. It took approximately 3 months to understand how it worked if you had it explained to you. If you were encountering it for the first time without explanation, it was essentially unreadable. I had not included a guide to the reconciliation file in my transition document. I want to be precise about this. I had not sabotaged anything. I had not deleted files or corrupted data, or done anything that would constitute misconduct. I had simply not gone beyond what was strictly required. The transition document outlined the processes I was asked to document. Honoring the reconciliation file's internal notation system was a methodology I had developed over years and had never been asked to document, because until the day I was replaced, no one had imagined a scenario in which I would not be there. When is the quarterly review? Gideon asked. 12 days from now, I said. He was quiet for a moment. Okay, he said. On day 2, Gideon texted me 3 words. She asked IT at Aldercroft was a 2-person department that handled hardware, basic troubleshooting, and the maintenance of the system the external developer had built to my specifications. They knew how to maintain it. They did not know how to explain the methodology behind it. That was not their job. I did not respond to the text. On day 3, he called. She had a meeting with Dorian that ran 2 hours. He said, I don't know what was said, but she came out of it looking... He paused, selecting the word carefully. Smaller. Dorian would be discovering, by day 3, things that I suspected he had not fully considered when he made the decision he made. He would be discovering that the quarterly review was not a presentation. It was a detailed technical audit of client performance metrics, risk assessment, and strategic recommendations produced from data that lived in the reconciliation file and the system I had built, requiring someone who understood both. He would be discovering that the external developer who had built the system was no longer contracted with Aldercroft. That contract had lapsed 14 months ago, and that the only person who fully understood the system's architecture was me. He would be discovering that Osric Hargrove had not responded to Seraphine's follow-up email from the day 1 meeting. I knew all of this not because I was watching in real time, but because I had known it would happen. 7 years of building something means 7 years of understanding exactly what it requires to keep standing. On day 4, Osric Hargrove called my personal number. I was at my kitchen table. The city outside my window was doing what it did in early spring, half gray and half almost bright. The kind of light that can't quite commit. I answered. "Miss Vesper," he said. He had always called me that. Not Miss. Not by my last name. Miss Vesper, in the formal mode of an older generation that had its own logic. "Mr. Hargrove, I've been trying to understand the new arrangement." His voice was precise and measured. "I wanted to speak with you directly." "I appreciate that," I said. "I'll be honest with you. The woman they've assigned has called me twice. In the second call, she referred to our March filing as a formality." A pause. "It is not a formality." The March filing for Hargrove and Associates was a regulatory submission with a legal deadline, tied to 3 separate jurisdictional requirements that had to be reconciled and submitted in sequence. I had managed this filing for 5 consecutive years. One year, the deadline had fallen on a Sunday, and I had worked through the weekend to ensure everything was in order. It was not a formality in any interpretation of that word. "I understand," I said. "I want to ask you something directly," Osric said. "Of course." "Are you available to work?" I had been waiting for this question. I am not hoping for it. I had known it was coming. Osric Hargrove was a man who operated on relationships and on competence, and he had understood within 48 hours that the competence he relied on had been removed from his account. "I've recently started a consultancy," I said. There was a brief silence. "What are your rates?" I told him. I had researched this carefully. My rate was the correct market rate for the level of expertise I was providing, which happened to be considerably higher than my former salary, because consulting rates include the premium of availability and specialist knowledge. "When can you begin?" he said. "This week," I said. The consultancy had existed technically for 11 days. I had incorporated it the week before my final day at Aldercroft. Oh, not in anticipation of anything dramatic. I want to be clear about this, but because I had understood for 8 months that my position was not secure. And the most practical response to insecurity is preparation. It was called simply Vesper Consulting, registered, licensed, with a business account and a clean website that said very little but said it precisely. I had 1 client on record before Osric Hargrove called, a small firm I had been informally advising for several months, the kind of arrangement that exists in a gray space before it becomes formal. The day after Osric's call, I added Hargrove and Associates to my client roster. Gideon called that evening. "She's at her desk at 9 o'clock at night," he said. "Is she making progress?" "Hard to say. She keeps asking people questions they don't know how to answer." He paused. Dorian came back in at 7. He looked at something on her screen for a long time, and then left without saying anything. I thought about Dorian looking at the reconciliation file. I thought about him understanding, perhaps for the first time, the full architecture of what I had built, and what it would take to rebuild from the outside. "She's trying," I said. It was the most I was willing to give. "She's trying things she was told she could do," Gideon said. "Those are different." He was right. They were different. One is effort. The other is error of judgment compounded until the compound is the problem. On day 5, at 11:47 in the morning, Seraphine resigned. Gideon did not call me this time. He sent a voice note, 4 seconds long. That said only, "She's gone." I was in a coffee shop 2 blocks from my apartment. Alma working through the Hargrove March filing, which I had begun the night before using the methodology I had developed over 5 years, and which lived in its complete form only in my own head and my own archived documents. I listened to the voice note twice. I put my phone face down on the table. I kept working. I'll tell you what I know about why she left, because Gideon found out, and what he found out mattered. Seraphine had been told by Dorian that the role was primarily strategic. Client relationships, high-level oversight. The operational complexity would be handled by the existing team. What Dorian had failed to understand, and what I had understood from the first month I held the role, was that the existing team was composed of people I had trained, executing processes I had designed, against systems I had built. In ways their competence was real, but it was calibrated to working within a structure. The structure required someone who understood its total logic to maintain it, Without that person, the team was capable and directionless in equal measure. On day 3, when it became clear that the March filing required knowledge she didn't have, Seraphine had asked the team to walk her through it. The team had tried, but explaining a 5-year methodology to someone who hadn't built it in 2 days is not a training exercise. It is an excavation, and the soil keeps shifting. On day 4, she had called Dorian and asked him to bring in external support, a consultant to help manage the Hargrove account through the quarterly review. He had told her they would find a solution internally. On day 5, she had submitted her resignation, not with notice. Out immediately, she cited, according to Gideon, a mismatch between the role as described and the role as it exists. That sentence was more accurate than she probably realized. The period between Seraphine's resignation and Aldercroft's first official contact with me lasted approximately 6 hours. During those 6 hours, I can only imagine because I was not there, the specific quality of panic that spreads through a company when it realizes simultaneously that a critical process has no operator, a major client is disengaged, a quarterly review is 11 days out, and the person who built all of it left the building 12 days ago. I imagine Dorian in his office. I imagine the color of that afternoon. The call came at 5:43. It was not from Dorian, it was from Elena, Aldercroft's head of human resources. A practical woman who operated without sentiment and whom I had always respected because she spoke to problems as problems and not as performances. "Vesper," she said. "Elena?" "I'll be direct." She paused. "We have a significant operational gap." "I'm aware," I said. "Is there any circumstance under which you would consider returning to Aldercroft?" I had written the answer to this question 7 days ago, not because I'd been certain she would call, but because being uncertain and being unprepared are different things, and I had stopped conflating them a long time before. "There's a circumstance," I said. "I'd need to discuss it in person." "When are you available?" "Tomorrow morning," I said. "My office?" There was a brief pause. I think she had expected to offer me their office. Choosing the location, small, seemingly administrative, was not a power move in the dramatic sense. It was simply accurate to the situation. I was the one with something they needed. The meeting should reflect that. 9 o'clock, she said. 9 works, I said. I want to be honest about the night before that meeting, because the story as I've told it so far has a cleanliness to it that real things rarely have. The truth is that I sat in my apartment at 11 o'clock and felt, for the first time since the termination letter, something adjacent to the thing I had not let myself feel while everything was happening. Not devastation, more like the long, quiet exhaust of vigilance. The specific tiredness of someone who has been prepared for so long that preparation itself has become its own kind of weight. 7 years. I had spent 7 years building something in a house that was not mine. I had built the walls and the floors and the systems that made everything run, and then I had been informed on a Tuesday morning over a burned cup of coffee that the house no longer needed me. The part they had not considered, the part that Dorian, in his particular failure of imagination, had not stopped to think through, was that I had known the house better than I had ever let anyone see. I had known exactly which walls were load-bearing. I poured a glass of water. I went to bed. In the morning, I was precise and rested. Elena came to my office, which was currently my kitchen table, with a good lamp and a plant I had purchased specifically because I thought I might be taking calls in this space for some time. She came alone, and I had made better coffee than the conference room ever managed. She sat down across from me, and she did not waste time. "What would it take to bring you back?" "I'm not coming back to the role," I said. "My consultancy is active. I have clients, including Hargrove and Associates, who have engaged me directly." I paused to let that land. "What I'm willing to discuss is a contract." Elena's expression did not change, but something in it shifted. "A consulting contract?" "A senior consulting contract. Defined scope, fixed term. I'd suggest 12 months initially, renewable. I'd manage the Hargrove account and oversee the quarterly review and the March filing. I would not be an employee. I would be an external contractor with deliverables and a rate." "What rate?" I told her. She was quiet for a moment. And then, That's 3 times your former salary on an annualized basis. I know, I said. It's also considerably less than the cost of losing the Hargrove account. I kept my voice level. I was not performing. I was reporting. Their annual contract is 40% of Aldercroft's revenue. If they disengage, the company's position shifts materially within 1 quarter. My rate for a 12-month contract is approximately 11% of what that account generates annually. Elena was a practical woman. She looked at the numbers the way a practical person looks at numbers, not emotionally, just to see if they were true. They were true. I'll need to discuss this with the board, she said. Of course, I said. I'd also like you to know that Osric Hargrove has indicated, through our conversations, that he would prefer to continue working with me in my current capacity. I can have him send a formal communication to that effect, if it would be useful for internal discussions. Elena looked at me for a moment. That would be useful, she said. I'll arrange it, I said. She left 37 minutes after she arrived. I called Osric Hargrove immediately after. Would you be willing to send a formal note to Aldercroft's board expressing your preference for continuity of account management? I asked. I already drafted one this morning, he said. I was waiting for the appropriate moment. I smiled, which he could not see. Now would be the moment, I said. While I waited for Aldercroft's board to deliberate, I kept working. The Hargrove March filing was my immediate priority. I worked through it over 4 days. I was using the methodology I'd refined over 5 years, the notation system, the reconciliation structure, the 3-jurisdiction sequence. I worked efficiently and without urgency because I knew the deadline and I knew the process and I had done this before. On the 2nd day, Gideon called with an update. The board met yesterday, 2 hours. Dorian was in the room. What do you know? I know that the Hargrove letter arrived during the meeting. Osric apparently wrote it personally, not his assistant. 2 paragraphs. I thought about Osric Hargrove sitting down to write 2 paragraphs. He was not a man who wrote things he didn't mean, and he was not a man who wrote things personally when a delegate would do. And? I said. Dorian came out looking... Gideon searched for the word. Reassessed. Reassessed. That was exactly the right word. Not humiliated. Dorian was not the type who wore humiliation visibly. Reassessed. In the way that a person who has made a miscalculation and knows, it looks when they are in the process of recalibrating. I thought about him in that meeting room, reading Osric Hargrove's personal letter about why he needed to continue working with me. I thought about the board members looking at the numbers Elena had brought in. I thought about the moment when the cost of the decision they had made became concrete rather than abstract. Thank you, I said to Gideon. Are you coming back? He said. Not in the way I was before, I said. He understood what that meant. I had always appreciated that about him. Elena called on day 4 after our kitchen table meeting. The board has reviewed your proposal. Well, there are some terms they'd like to discuss. What terms? The contract length. They'd prefer 6 months initially. 12 months, I said. With a performance review at 6. If either party chooses not to renew, 90 days notice. A pause. They'd also like to discuss scope, specifically whether your consultancy engages with any other firms in a directly competing capacity during the contract period. This was the question I had prepared for with Balthazar. He had been clear. A non-compete clause in a consulting contract was negotiable, and in my position, something I should resist or carefully limit. I will not engage with direct competitors of Aldercroft on accounts that overlap with my deliverables for Aldercroft, I said. That's a reasonable and specific restriction. Well, I won't agree to broader limitations on my practice. That may be acceptable, Elena said. The rate is not negotiable, I said. She paused. I understand, she said. The contract, as eventually signed, included the 12-month term, the performance review clause, the specific and limited non-compete, and the rate I had named. It also included, and this was something Balthazar had suggested and I was glad to have, a clause establishing that any systems, methodologies, or documentation I produced in the course of the contract were developed under a licensed arrangement, not as work for hire. The IP language was careful and detailed. I read the contract twice before I signed it. Then I signed it. My first day back at Aldercroft under the new arrangement was a Thursday. The building smelled the same, and the lobby still used that citrus cleaning product. The elevator had the same particular hum it always had, slightly lower than you expected. I had my own visitor badge now, because I was not an employee. This was a small thing that turned out to matter more than I expected. There is a particular clarity in the visitor badge. It says, "I am here on specific terms, for specific purposes, and when those purposes are complete, I will leave." It eliminates the ambient anxiety of belonging to something that can decide to stop belonging to you. I set up at a temporary workspace. Not my old desk, which had been returned to its original configuration, not Seraphine's configuration, which had apparently not lasted long enough to become configuration. And I opened my laptop. The first person who came to speak to me was Mara, from the accounts team, and who had been there for 3 years, and who had always been quietly competent and somewhat underestimated. She sat down across from me and said, "Where do you need us?" I looked at her. "The March filing first," I said. "Then the quarterly review. Walk me through where everything currently stands." She did. It took 45 minutes. What I found was what I had expected. The processes were intact, because the team was competent, but the coordination layer, the thing I had provided, was absent. Everything was moving, but nothing was moving together. Over the next 3 days, I rebuilt the coordination, not dramatically, task by task, conversation by conversation, the reconciliation file reintegrated with the workflow, the March filing sequencing back on track, the Hargrove client communication resumed in the register that Osric expected. On day 3, Osric Hargrove called to say he had reviewed my preliminary communication and was satisfied with the progress. He used the word satisfied. For Osric, that was the equivalent of enthusiastic. I encountered Dorian on the 4th day. This was deliberate on his part. He had given me space for 4 days, which was either courtesy or cowardice. And I had not sought him out, which was a decision I had made and not revisited. On the 4th day, he came to my workspace while I was reviewing the quarterly data and stood near the edge of it in a way that said he wanted to speak without making the approach formal. I looked up. "Good morning," I said. "Good morning." He paused. "How is it going?" "Well," I said, "the filing will be submitted on time. The quarterly review is on track." He nodded. He had his hands in his pockets, which was a posture I recognized. It was how he stood when he was working out how to say something. "I want you to know," he began. "Dorian," I said. He stopped. "The work is going well," I said. "I appreciate that." He was quiet for a moment. He understood, I think, that I was not going to give him the conversation he had come over to have. Not because I was being cruel, but because there was nothing in that conversation that would change anything or produce anything useful, and I had stopped spending energy on things that didn't produce anything useful. "Right," he said. "Did you need anything else?" I asked. He said no. He walked back across the floor. I went back to the quarterly data. So I want to pause here and explain the thing that people often miss when they hear a story like this. The part where the protagonist wins and it looks clean and satisfying, as if the victory were the product of a single good decision or a single bold move. It wasn't. What I had done over the 8 months before I was fired was boring. It was meticulous and repetitive and sometimes felt paranoid. Keeping a parallel documentation archive means saving files you may never need. Researching IP law means reading documents that are dense and often inconclusive. Noting the patterns in a colleague's advancement and then tracking your own position against those patterns is not exciting. It is the opposite of exciting. It is the work of someone who has decided that reality is more important than the story she would prefer to be living. The story I would have preferred to live, was one where my work was simply recognized. Where 7 years of building something mattered in the way that 7 years of building something should matter. Where I didn't have to watch someone positioned above me for reasons that had nothing to do with operational capability. That story was not available. What was available was preparation. And preparation, done quietly and specifically over 8 months, produced a situation in which the person who thought they had eliminated me had not eliminated me at all. They had simply reclassified me from internal asset to external one, on different terms that I controlled. I was earning 3 times my former salary. I had a client relationship that no employment contract could reach. I had a consultancy that would outlast any single contract. And in the system I had built, the one they still used, still informally called the Vesper system, operated within an IP framework that meant any future iterations would require my involvement or my authorization. The licensing clause had been Balthazar's suggestion. I had been glad to take it. The March filing was submitted on schedule, on a Wednesday afternoon, in the correct sequential order across all 3 jurisdictions, without incident. I sent Osric Hargrove a brief note confirming submission. He responded within the hour. As expected, thank you, Miss Vesper. From Osric, that sentence contained more warmth than most people's paragraphs. The quarterly review happened on a Friday. 16 people in a conference room that smelled, as it always did, of burned coffee. I presented the Hargrove account data, the risk assessment, and the strategic recommendations. I presented the reconciliation figures in the format the board had used for 3 years, which was a format I had designed. Osric was there in person, which was not always the case. He sat at the end of the table in the particular stillness of someone who is listening with complete attention. He asked 2 questions, both of them precise. I answered them. After the meeting, as people gathered their materials, he came over and said quietly, "I appreciate the continuity." "So do I," said. He nodded once, the way he did when something had been settled, and left the room. 3 weeks into the contract, Gideon asked me to come for a coffee. We went to the place 2 blocks from the office that had the actual good espresso, the kind that Aldercroft's conference room had never and would never produce. It was a small place, dark wood and afternoon light, and we sat at the corner table, and for a while we didn't talk about work at all. He asked about the consultancy. I told him it was growing. I had taken on a second client, a mid-size firm in a different sector, that had found me through a professional contact who had seen my work and decided it was worth paying for. "Are you going to renew the Aldercroft contract?" he said. "Probably," I said. "It's a good anchor client." "But not the only one." "No," I said, "not the only one." He drank his coffee. He was quiet in the comfortable way of someone who doesn't need to fill silence. "She came back," he said, after a moment. I looked at him. "Seraphine, she came back to collect something she'd left. A jacket, I think." He paused. "She didn't say anything to anyone." "Oh, in and out." I thought about that. A jacket left at a job that lasted 5 days. The particular small awkwardness of retrieving something from a place that hadn't worked out. "I hope she finds something that fits better," I said. I meant it. The anger I might have felt toward her had never really materialized. She had been positioned, as I had been positioned, within a situation designed by someone else. Her error was not the positioning. It was the confidence she had arrived with before she understood the ground beneath her feet. Gideon looked at me with the expression of someone watching a situation they respect. "You're genuinely not angry," he said. "I was," I said. "For about 2 days. It's not very useful after that." 6 months into the contract, the performance review happened. I had done what I said I would do. The Hargrove account was stable, engaged, and had, through the careful management of the quarterly review and 2 subsequent client developments, increased its engagement with Aldercroft in a way that was tracked and attributable. The March filing had proceeded without incident. The systems were running cleanly, and I had produced updated documentation, comprehensive, clear, held under the licensed arrangement, that gave Aldercroft's team better capacity to operate within the structure I had built. I had not rebuilt the structure for them. I had made it more readable. There is a difference. In the performance review, Elena presented figures. They were positive. She said the board was interested in discussing renewal. "What terms?" I said. "They'd like to extend to 18 months from the current end date." "Same rate." I had my response ready. 18 months, current rate adjusted for cost of living. And I'd like to add a clause allowing me to bring in associates from my consultancy on an as-needed basis for specific projects. Elena made a note. "I think that's achievable," she said. "There is one more thing I want to tell you, because it happened and it was real, and it would be dishonest to leave it out. Dorian came to find me on the last Friday before the contract renewal was signed. Not at the workspace. He texted and asked if I had time for a coffee, which was a different kind of approach. More considered, more honest about what it was. We went to the same place Gideon and I had gone. I ordered the same thing. He ordered an Americano and turned the cup in his hands when it arrived. And he said, "I owe you an apology." I looked at the table. I looked at the light coming through the window. I thought about what I wanted from this moment, and I was honest with myself that what I wanted was not an apology. Not really. I had processed what had happened and built something in its aftermath, and the apology was a conversation that belonged to Dorian more than it belonged to me. "I know what happened," I said. "I understand why you made the decision you made. I don't need the apology." He looked like he wanted to say more. "I do appreciate it," I said. "But what I care about is the work. And the work is going well?" He nodded. He seemed to understand that I was not softening toward him in the way he might have hoped. I was simply telling him the truth, which was that the work mattered to me, and the rest of it had already been filed somewhere I didn't need to access regularly. We drank our coffees. We talked about the Hargrove account and the upcoming client development project. We talked about the system upgrade that was overdue and that I had been preparing a proposal for. When we left, we had not resolved anything emotional. We had not reached an understanding that changed the shape of what had happened. We were two people who had a professional relationship to maintain and who had, sitting in a coffee shop on a Friday afternoon, established that the professional relationship was intact. That was enough. That was, in fact, exactly enough. The contract renewal was signed on a Tuesday morning. I did not go into the office. Elena sent it electronically. I signed it at my kitchen table. The same table where I had met her 7 months ago with the lamp and the plant and the good coffee. The plant had grown. I had repotted it once. It was doing well. I sent the signed document back, and then I opened the file I had been working on. A proposal for a methodology update to the client management system. The proposal outlined a set of improvements I had been considering for 2 years and had never had the structural position to implement. As an external consultant operating under a licensing arrangement, I had both the leverage and the framework to do it properly. The proposal was addressed to Aldercroft's board. It was also, in the way that good proposals are, a document that contained within it a future. A system that would, after the update, require quarterly licensing maintenance from the firm that held its methodology. IP my firm, I read the proposal through from the beginning. It was clean, it was specific. It said what it meant. I attached it to an email, I sent it. Later that afternoon, Osric Hargrove called. He had been copied on the proposal by Elena. A courtesy communication, standard practice for major account clients who might be affected by system changes. "I've reviewed the proposal," he said. "Any concerns?" I asked. "No concerns. I'd like to see it implemented." "I'll begin the planning phase next week," I said. "Good," he said. There was a brief pause, the comfortable kind. "Miss Vesper," he said, "your consultancy, do you take on new clients?" I smiled. "Selectively," I said. "I may have a referral." He rang off. I put the phone down on the kitchen table. Outside the window, the city was in the particular early spring light it had been in 8 months ago, when everything was still uncertain, and I was building something in the quiet. The uncertainty was gone. The building was still happening. I picked up my coffee, which was at exactly the right temperature. I got back to work. Osric Hargrove's referral turned out to be a firm called Fosgate and Partners. Older, quieter, and with the specific operational complexity of a client who had never been managed by someone who understood what they actually needed. Osric had mentioned my name to their senior partner with the particular directness of someone who does not recommend people lightly. I had a call with their senior partner on a Wednesday morning. It lasted 20 minutes. By the end of it, they had engaged Vesper Consulting for a 6-month assessment and operational review. 2 clients now, Aldercroft and Fosgate. Neither of them were anchors in the way Aldercroft had once felt like an anchor. They were now simply clients, valued, maintained, delivering revenue to a practice that was mine, and that I had built with the same attention I had once given to someone else's walls and floors. Gideon sent me a birthday message in April. He included a single line at the end. "The coffee machine is still there." I told him I knew. Some things you leave behind on purpose. Some things you leave because the leaving is itself a kind of message. Quiet, durable, and entirely clear to anyone who knows how to read it. The Aldercroft system upgrade began in May. I brought in 2 associates from my consultancy, Mira, a systems specialist I had worked with before, and Thaddeus, a documentation expert who was meticulous and fast. We ran the project in 12 weeks. The updated system was cleaner, more scalable, and documented in a way that Aldercroft's team could operate within without needing to call me for every complication. That was intentional. A good consultant makes herself necessary for the right reasons, not because she has withheld knowledge. The right reason in this case was the methodology licensing. The system architecture belonged, under the IP framework Balthazar had helped me establish, to Vesper Consulting. Aldercroft used it under license. Any future updates would come through us. Not because I had structured it to be punishing, because that was the accurate valuation of what I had created. The upgrade project was delivered on time and on budget. The board sent a formal commendation. I filed it. Elena asked me in late June whether I had considered returning full-time. We were in the Aldercroft conference room. The coffee was still burned. Some things do not change. No, I said. Not full-time. The board would be willing to discuss an enhanced package. Director level, salary to match your consulting rate, plus benefits and equity participation. It was a significant offer. I sat with it for a moment, not because I was tempted, but because it deserved to be heard properly. I appreciate the offer, I said, and I want to be honest with you. The consulting arrangement works for me in ways that employment doesn't. It's not about the money. She looked at me. It's about the structure, I said. As a consultant, so I have a defined relationship with deliverables and outcomes. I have a practice that extends beyond any one client. What you're offering would consolidate that back into a single organization, and I've learned, in a specific way, that I prefer not to be consolidated. Elena was quiet for a moment. I understand, she said. She did understand, I think. She was a practical woman, and what I had said was practical. The consulting contract is working well, I said. I'd like to keep it working well. Agreed, she said. The coffee in my cup was the temperature it always was in that room, not quite hot enough anymore. I left it. In August, Gideon left Aldercroft. He called me on a Tuesday afternoon, a Tuesday I noticed, and said he had been offered a position at a firm called Pendleton Analytics. One step up from where he'd been, much better scope, better management. Congratulations, I said. I wanted to tell you before I told anyone there, he said. I appreciated that. When do you start? I asked. 1st of September? He paused. Are you busy? 1st of September evening. I can be unbusy, I said. Good. I know a place with excellent coffee. Vesper Consulting, as of September, had 4 clients. Aldercroft on the 18-month contract, renewable. Fosgate and Partners on the original 6-month assessment, now extended. A 3rd client, a medium-sized financial services firm who had come through a professional contact of Osric Hargroves. And a 4th, smaller engagement, a short-term project on a fixed fee that had come directly through the consultancy website. The website, which had said very little at the beginning, now had a services page and a short statement of practice. Nothing marketing, nothing about me specifically, just what we did and what it was worth. Mira was working with me regularly enough that we had established a formal arrangement. Thaddeus less so. His work was project-specific, but he was available and reliable when needed. I had, by this point, more than replaced the income I had lost. I had built something with a different shape, distributed, resilient, mine. One Tuesday morning in September, I sat at my kitchen table. The lamp, the plant, which had outgrown its 2nd pot and would need a 3rd, and I drank a cup of coffee that was exactly the right temperature. I had a call at 9 with Fosgate's senior partner. A proposal to review at 10, the Aldercroft quarterly data to check in the afternoon. I opened my laptop. Yet, I began. Osric Hargrove sent me a note in October. He sent physical notes sometimes, on his firm's letterhead, the kind of correspondence that belonged to a mode of communication that most people had abandoned. I found them in my mailbox and kept them in a folder. This one said, "The March filing is already in hand, I presume." I had begun work on it in September. I wrote back, also by hand, on paper, which I had started doing for his correspondence specifically, and said, "Well in hand, as expected." He would find that funny, in the dry and minimal way that Osric found things funny. The last thing I'll tell you is about the coffee machine. In November, Aldercroft renovated their floor. New furniture, new layout. They replaced most of the existing equipment, including the conference room pot that had always brewed too early and sat too long. They kept the small machine in the corner, the one I had requested 3 years ago and left behind on my last day. Mara from the accounts team texted me about it. She had been at Aldercroft through all of this, had watched the whole arc, and had become someone I consulted with on specific operational questions in a way that was professional and, I think, mutual. "They kept your coffee machine," she said. I looked at the message for a moment. "Good," I said. I put my phone down and poured a cup from my own machine, which made better coffee than any office machine I had ever used, and which sat on my kitchen counter beside the plant that had outgrown 2 pots and was working on its 3rd. I did not look back at the message. I closed the door.
Okay, good. I make fun of him for that every time I get. As you should. I know, you did, dear. I know. That's yours. Mossy Waterfalls to die for, thank you. I just finished. No, I think today I'm going to work on, and we're just fucking freeballing it. Sorry. I got my teeth cleaned on an anti-gravity lawn chair in the storage room of a YMCA gymnasium. Now, Cryptid, you know I'm going to need more information on that. You know that I'm going to need more about that. Kaylee? You've come from... Kaylee. You guys came from Liz's stream? A bunch of people came from Liz's stream? So, I know you don't expect painting in an art stream. Free word it? Well, finally a streamer who paints. Hi, Jay. Happy Tuesday. Make looking at a toothbrush enjoyable. I saw it when I was in the shower and I was like, it's so beautiful. Art stream where people actually... So you know what's crazy though, is that I painted this in one stream, I painted this in one stream, I painted half of this in another stream. I have actually been... Now, see, Stumpy, who joined us recently, was like, what do you mean you don't paint anything? All I've seen is you being productive. Now you're understanding it, I imagine, Stumpy. No, Frisson, what was it? What was your beautiful message? Julie does a blank paper bit. Oh, that's what we're doing. We're showing off the quality of the paper. I love Julie. Yes. That's exactly right. Julie gets it. Oh, I put my leopard gecko on my brother's bestie's head and promised he'd likely not poop, to which he said he's not worried as he's had people poop on him. Laughed, remembered he's a nurse. Yeah. God, fucking... Just thank you to nurses for your service. A nice clean slate. Yeah, satisfying. That's exactly right. I need to wait. This is way too green. This will never do.